The marble floors echoed with the hurried footsteps of diplomats, security personnel, and journalists. Flags of every nation lined the Great Hall, but all eyes were on one country, Burkina Faso. A name that had recently become synonymous with defiance, rebellion, and revolution. And at the center of it all stood Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the 36-year-old soldier-turned-statesman who had shaken the foundations of Western dominance in Africa. News anchors speculated. Analysts dismissed him. Leaders ignored him. But the people of Africa listened. Across villages in Mali, city squares in Kenya, classrooms in Ghana, and markets in Nigeria, radios crackled with anticipation. Traoré was about to speak. And no one, not even the most seasoned observers, knew what he would say. Inside the UN General Assembly chamber, there was a tense silence. Delegates from the West adjusted their earpieces. Emmanuel Macron sat stoically, flanked by advisors. Donald Trump envoy took notes. Representatives from Africa looked nervous, some hopeful, others afraid. Then the announcement. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso, you have the floor. He rose, not in a tailored suit like most heads of state, but in his olive-green military uniform. No entourage. No polished teleprompter speech. Just a worn-out folder and a fire burning in his chest. As he walked up to the podium, cameras zoomed in. You could see the intensity in his eyes, the kind of intensity that comes from pain, betrayal, and love for a wounded continent. He stood silently for a moment, letting the room absorb the weight of what was about to happen. Then he leaned forward into the microphone and said in a deep, firm voice, "Before I speak to the world, I speak to Africa." The room shifted. Diplomats straightened. Some smirked. Others froze. But Traoré was only getting started. "Today, I do not come here to beg. I do not come here to please. I come to remind the world that Africa is not a playground. We are not your raw material depot. We are not your military base. We are not your dumping ground for expired goods and bad policies." He paused. His words were slow, sharp, like daggers dipped in truth. "We have been silent too long. We danced while they took our diamonds. We smiled while they siphoned our oil. We bowed while they mocked our poverty, a poverty they created. But today we rise. Today we speak." At that moment, the world held its breath. Because this was not a speech, it was the beginning of a storm. The room was still. No coughs. No whispers. No shifting in seats. Just silence thick enough to cut with a blade. Then Captain Ibrahim Traoré raised his head and, with chilling clarity, did the unthinkable. He turned directly to French President Emmanuel Macron, seated just rows away. "Mr. Macron," he began, "you sit here today as the leader of a nation that has built its wealth on Africa's poverty. France, you owe Africa." Guess. Audible. Shock swept the chamber like a cold wind. "You owe us for the gold taken from Burkina Faso's soil. For the uranium pulled from Niger to light up Paris while our people sit in darkness. For the CFA franc, your colonial currency, still shackling 14 African nations to your treasury." Macron didn't blink, but the fire in Traoré's words forced his advisors to glance nervously at each other. For decades, France positioned itself as Africa's friend. But how can a friend steal your bread, tax your water, and then offer you crumbs with a smile? Traoré's voice rose, not in rage, but in righteousness. His accent was unapologetically African. His tone, iron-forged in suffering. "Your military bases? Uninvited. Your so-called humanitarian aid? A leash, not a lifeline. You extract, you exploit, and you disguise it as diplomacy. This isn't partnership. It's plunder in a tuxedo." A few African delegates clapped, timidly. Others bowed their heads in shame. But Traoré wasn't looking for applause. He was hunting for accountability. "You fear our independence. You fear an Africa that no longer bends to your command. That's why you slander me. That's why your media calls me a rebel, a threat. But let me tell you something, Mr. Macron. D rather be hated for defending Africa than praised for selling her soul." The room trembled, not from noise, but from truth laid bare. "You taught us French, but never taught us freedom. You drew our borders, divided our tribes, and named us Francophone, as if your language was a gift and not a chain. He stepped closer to the mic. We don't want your gifts. We want our dignity. There was the line that struck the world like thunder. And in that moment, Ibrahim Traoré didn't just confront France. He exposed the architecture of colonial arrogance still standing behind polite smiles and diplomatic handshakes. He pulled back the curtain. He made the invisible visible. Then he paused, letting the weight of his words ripple through the marble walls of the UN chamber. And let history record this day, he said finally, as the day a soldier from Burkina Faso told the emperor, your empire is built on the bones of Africa. And the bones are rising. With that, the temperature in the room dropped. But for millions watching back home in Africa, it was the first time they felt the warmth of someone speaking their pain into power. After blasting France with facts that few had dared to voice on a global stage, Captain Ibrahim Traoré did something even more audacious. He turned his fire inward, towards the very people who shared his skin, his continent, and his language. But France alone is not to blame, he declared, voice steady and eyes piercing. They only took what we allowed. The real betrayal, the deepest wound, came from within. A chill swept across the African delegation seats. Presidents, ministers, and diplomats froze in their chairs. The soldier from Ouagadougou was no longer aiming at the West. He was calling out Africa's own rulers. We've had over 60 years since so-called independence. And what have many of our leaders done with it? They've sold our resources for Swiss bank accounts. They've danced at foreign banquets while their people die for bread. He scanned the room slowly, pausing just long enough to make the discomfort settle. You sit in this chamber dressed in European suits, speaking colonial languages, while villages in your countries have no schools, no hospitals, no roads. His voice cracked, not from weakness, but from sorrow. You watched Libya burn. You watched Gaddafi fall. You watched a son of Africa dragged in the dirt by NATO bombs and foreign puppets. And you said nothing. You hid. You played it safe. You betrayed your brother. There was no applause. Only silence. The kind that hurts the ears. Ask yourselves this. If a Western leader were attacked like Gaddafi, would Europe be silent? Would America fold its arms and say, it's not our business? Never. But you watched as they killed a dreamer. Traoré took a deep breath. And that is why Africa bleeds. Not because of Europe's strength, but because of our cowardice. Because too many of our so-called leaders have become caretakers of Western interest, not champions of African dignity. He paused, pointing his finger in no specific direction but to every soul in power across the continent. You take loans you don't understand. You sign contracts you don't read. You send your children to school in France and treat your own people like dirt. Tell me, how are you different from the colonizers? The question lingered in the air, sharp as a blade. Leadership is not about titles. It is not about UN speeches or luxury cars. Leadership is about sacrifice. And the day we choose truth over comfort, dignity over dollars, that day Africa will be free. Some looked away. Others clenched their fists. A few whispered amongst themselves. But one thing was certain, no African leader listening that day could say they hadn't been told. And millions of young Africans watching on their phones, radios, and TVs whispered one thing in unison. He's talking to them. But he's speaking for us. The chamber was still gripped by the weight of Traoré's message to Africa's leaders. But then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he reached into the worn folder he had carried with him and pulled out a single photograph. Faded, wrinkled at the corners, but unmistakable. It was a picture of Muammar Gaddafi, the Libyan leader whose brutal death had shocked the world and devastated the dream of a united Africa. Traoré held it high. This man, he said, was not perfect. None of us are. But he had a dream. A dream of an Africa with one army, one currency, one passport. A dream where Africa controlled its own oil, its own banks, its own destiny. Some delegates looked away. Others stiffened. The Western media cameras zoomed in, eager for a new headline. And what did you do? He asked, voice now rising, tremors of emotion barely held in check. Who? African leaders. You let them slaughter him. You watched as NATO turned Libya into ashes. You listened to their lies, their propaganda. You stood by as they lynched your own brother. He turned, facing the Western delegations with fury and pain in his eyes. You called it liberation. I call it murder. State-sanctioned, foreign-funded, media-justified murder. Macron remained stoic. The US ambassador looked uncomfortable. But Traoré wasn't looking for their approval. You feared Gaddafi because he made you feel small. Because he dared to dream bigger than your borders, your paychecks, your foreign aid. He wanted an Africa that stood eye to eye with the West, not knee to ground. His voice softened, just enough for the sorrow to cut deeper. They bombed him because he threatened the dollar with a gold-backed African currency. Because he threatened Western arms sales with an African army. Because he threatened their control with unity. He looked again at the photo in his hand. This man built homes for his people before he built palaces. He gave free electricity, education, healthcare, long before some of your countries even had working hospitals. Then he said what many thought, but few dared to voice. If Gaddafi had been white, Western history books would call him a visionary. But because he was African, he was painted as a madman. And you, African leaders, swallowed the story and helped write his obituary. There was no reaction from the chamber, just silence. The kind that settles in when truth leaves no room to breathe. I do not ask you to agree with everything he did, Traoré continued, but I ask you this, did he deserve that death? And more importantly, if they could do that to him, what makes you think you're safe? It was not just a warning. It was a revelation. The kind that ripples through generations. Today, I remember him. Not as a perfect man, but as a bold one. And I ask this assembly to remember, when Africa dreams of freedom, you label us threats. When we demand justice, you call it aggression. He laid the photo down, gently, like a flag on a grave. But Africa remembers. And Africa will rise. Not with vengeance, but with vision. Captain Ibrahim Traoré's hand lingered briefly on the photo of Gaddafi as he lowered it onto the podium. His voice, calm but thunderous, now shifted to the glaring hypocrisy of global politics, a truth many feared to say aloud but millions around the world could no longer ignore. He leaned forward, eyes scanning the powerful faces before him. "Let me ask a question," he said slowly. "A question that should shake the walls of this assembly." He paused, then thundered, "Can Africa fly jets into Paris and say it's for peace? Can we bomb Washington, remove your president, and say it's for human rights?" A wave of discomfort rippled through the chamber. No one responded. Not a nod. Not a shake of the head. Just tight jaws and clenched fists behind diplomatic silence. Because that's exactly what you did to Libya. That's what you've done in Iraq, in Syria, in Afghanistan. You launch wars in the name of democracy, but leave behind chaos, corpses, and corruption. His voice cracked with emotion, not weakness, but pain, inherited from decades of watching Africa brutalized in the name of peace. You preach sovereignty, yet violate ours. You speak of international law, yet break it when it suits your interests. You call us unstable, but who created the instability? Who lit the fire in Sudan? Who armed the rebels in Congo? Who funded coups behind closed embassy doors? He looked directly at the Western Bloc, speaking not just as a soldier, but as a mirror reflecting generations of betrayal. And when we raise our voices, when we try to stand, you send your media wolves. CNN, BBC, Le Monde, they call us dictators, warlords, terrorists. You control the narrative and then say the world is watching. But it is your camera, your angle, your lies. His finger jabbed the air. You killed Gaddafi and called it liberation. You invaded Iraq and called it justice. You robbed Africa, then offered aid and called it generosity. You've turned double standards into doctrine, hypocrisy into foreign policy. Then came the line that would be quoted for years to come. The West doesn't hate African corruption, they hate African control. He let the silence sink in again. It was heavy now, not just with discomfort, but with truth that bruises. If we dared to do to you what you've done to us, you would call it terrorism. But when you do it, it's diplomacy. That is the game. And Africa is done playing. Some Western delegates reached for their phones. Others whispered to aides. But Traoré continued, undaunted. You have nuclear weapons, but say Africa must disarm. You control the IMF, then tell us how to manage debt. You draw up climate goals while your factories pollute our skies. His voice dropped now, almost a whisper. Africa sees you. And more importantly, Africa is awakening. He ended the section not with rage, but with resolve. We don't want war. We want respect. But if respect must be fought for, then I say, let the world prepare. Because we are no longer afraid. The tension inside the chamber was now undeniable. Western delegates shifted in their seats, some pretending to scroll through notes, others avoiding the glare of Captain Ibrahim Traoré's gaze. Cameras panned across the hall, capturing unease on faces usually too composed to reveal emotion. But Traoré was not finished. Not even close. He paused, adjusted the microphone slightly, and leaned in with the calmness of a man who had made peace with his enemies long before stepping into the room. They say I am a threat, he said quietly. That I am dangerous. That I am defiant. He smiled faintly, then looked straight into the cameras broadcasting live to millions. Let them say it. Let them write it. Let them repeat it on their television screens. Because I would rather be hated by the Western press than loved for keeping Africa in chains. The room went still again. The kind of stillness that comes when a man speaks from the core of his soul. For decades, they've controlled our image. They decide who is civilized and who is savage. Who is a statesman and who is a warlord. They called Gaddafi a madman. They called Sankara a threat. And now, they call me a rebel. He paused again. But I know the truth. And so do the people watching me from the villages of Togo to the streets of Nairobi. I am not a villain. I am a mirror. I reflect what they fear most. An African who is not afraid. He took a breath and straightened his back. They don't fear my guns. They fear my words. They fear a generation of Africans who will no longer bow, no longer beg, and no longer believe in the lies fed to them since birth. He looked directly at the journalists seated near the back of the room. To the Western media, I say this. No matter how you spin my words, no matter how you twist my image, I will not be silent. You can call me a dictator in your headlines, but my people call me a defender. You can call me a rebel, but my people call me a brother. Traoré's voice softened but carried more weight than ever. When I walk through the streets of Burkina Faso, I see hungry children, tired mothers, jobless fathers. I don't need the BBC to tell me what my people suffer. And I don't need approval from Washington or Paris to love my continent. He looked back at the assembly. You ask me what I care about? I'll tell you. I care about restoring the honor that was stripped from our lands, our names, our languages. I care about a future where no African child must cross the sea to beg for a life in Europe. I care about planting the seeds of freedom so deep that not even 1,000 lies can bury them. Let them hate me, he repeated softly. But let Africa wake up because of me. And as he stood there, unshaken, unbent, the chamber realized this was no ordinary speech. This was a declaration. Captain Ibrahim Traoré let his final words about the media hang in the air like a verdict. He then turned the conversation toward something far more damning, a symbol of Africa's ongoing humiliation. Let's talk about shame, he said, looking around the chamber. Real shame. You see, Africa is rich. In oil, in gas, in minerals. But when you open the books, when you walk the streets of Lagos, Luanda, Port Harcourt, what do you find? Darkness. Poverty. Long queues for fuel. Generators humming where there should be electricity. But he did not wait for an answer. Because we drill our own oil, then ship it to Europe, Asia, and America. And we buy it back, refined, expensive, and polluted with taxes we do not set. This is the madness we have accepted. He pointed to the African delegations. We call ourselves oil-producing countries, but we cannot refine our own resources. We produce wealth for others and pain for ourselves. Oil leaves our ports in barrels, and what returns is debt. His tone was sharp, but the sadness in his voice was unmistakable. You build refineries for us with your loans, then control them through your corporations. You sell us fuel from our own soil. And still, you have the nerve to say we are poor managers. The chamber was quiet, but Traoré wasn't finished. How can a continent this blessed be so powerless? Because power is not about resources. Power is about control. And we surrendered control the day we let foreign companies dictate how we use what lies beneath our feet. He raised his hand, palm open. If we cannot refine our oil, then we cannot refine our future. If we cannot build our industries, we will always be customers in a world where the prices are set against us. He turned toward his fellow African leaders again. I do not blame the West for this entirely. I blame us. We who accepted bribes in exchange for control. We who allowed refineries to rot while we built presidential palaces. We who signed away our rights for short-term gains. Then, in a voice filled with both defiance and clarity, he said, I dream of an Africa that refines its own oil, builds its own cars, manufactures its own medicine. And the truth is, we have everything we need to do it, except the will to stand and say, enough. He paused, taking a breath. This is not just about crude oil. This is about dignity. It is about being able to wake up and know that your country does not depend on someone else to survive. That your children can inherit a nation, not a burden. He looked around one last time. If we do not control our resources, then we do not control our future. And I refuse to leave that kind of Africa for the next generation. The hall remained silent. But across the continent, in slums and schools, in fields and cities, something stirred. The kind that had been buried for far too long. Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood taller now. Not because his message was complete, but because he had finally reached the place where all revolutions are born, the heart. The chamber, once buzzing with distraction, now hung on every word. Some listened out of rage, some out of fear, but many, especially the youth watching across Africa, listened out of hope. Hope that for once, a leader would not speak of legacy in terms of buildings, medals, or titles, but in terms of truth. Let me be clear, he began slowly. I am not here to be remembered as a president. I am not building a dynasty. I do not dream of statues. I do not want airports or stadiums named after me. He paused. When I die, bury me in the same earth my ancestors walked on. No marble, no monuments. Just dust like every other child of Africa. He looked directly into the camera. If I am to be remembered, let it be for this. That in a time when Africa was mocked, sold, weakened and shamed, there was one man who stood up and said, no more. One man who spoke when silence was safe. One man who chose the hard road, because the easy one was betrayal. His voice trembled now, not with fear, but with depth. I know the consequences of what I've said today. I know the headlines they will write. I know the men in dark suits will whisper my name in rooms I'll never see. Let them plan. Let them plot. I'm not afraid, because I have already died in spirit the moment I saw my people living as strangers in their own land. The moment I watched our mothers walk miles for water, while tankers carried oil across oceans. The moment I saw African children drown in the Mediterranean, chasing dreams stolen from their soil. That was the death that changed me. He looked again at the African leaders seated before him. But there is still time. Time to rise. Time to choose courage over compromise. Time to trade silence for sovereignty. He turned slightly toward the United Nations seal behind him. You call this place the heart of global diplomacy. Then listen not with your ears, but with your conscience. Africa will no longer beg for a seat at the table. We are bringing our own. And if that table is not wide enough, we will build another. One carved from justice, not greed. From truth, not fear. He lowered his head for a moment, then lifted it again with a calm fire in his eyes. Tell your children, tell your history books, that once, in a world that asked us to bow, we stood. That once, in a room built by former empires, an African refused to be small. And in that refusal, he gave birth to a new voice. One they could no longer ignore. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré stepped down from the podium, the chamber didn't erupt in applause. There was no standing ovation. No diplomatic handshake. Only a thick, frozen silence that gripped the hall like a vice. The kind of silence that doesn't follow insult, but undeniable truth. He walked back to his seat alone. No entourage. No celebration. Just the echo of his words trailing behind him, burning in the air like smoke after a battlefield speech. Across the room, Western diplomats whispered among themselves, their faces strained. Some scribbled notes with urgency, others avoided eye contact. A few left their seats, unable to mask their discomfort. But what they didn't realize was that the tremor had already begun. By the time Traoré reached the doors of the assembly, the internet had exploded. His speech was clipped, translated, and streamed within minutes. Millions of young Africans shared it with captions like, "He said what our fathers were too afraid to," and "The day Africa finally spoke." In Lagos, students gathered around phone screens in hostels, cheering. In Dakar, elderly men in cafes sat in stunned silence, nodding slowly as they watched history unfold. In Nairobi, children mimicked his words, not in mockery, but in admiration. Even in Paris and Washington, commentators scrambled to control the narrative. Some called him dangerous. Others called him brave. But none could deny that something had shifted. The BBC tried to paint him as radical. CNN labeled him defiant. But these headlines only fueled the flames. Because the people could see through the noise now. They had heard a different voice. One not edited in a studio. One not wrapped in diplomatic pleasantries. They heard conviction. They heard pain. And more importantly, they heard power. Back in Ouagadougou, streets filled with chants. Markets closed early. Not out of fear, but out of celebration. The people didn't need an official holiday. They had already declared it themselves. A mother in a small village in Mali turned to her son and said, "One day, they will ask who restored Africa's pride. And we will say, it started with a soldier who spoke the truth when no one else would." Governments across Africa felt the shockwave. In boardrooms and ministries, the question wasn't whether Traoré had gone too far. It was whether they had gone too long pretending everything was fine. France summoned its ambassador for consultations. The European Union released a cautious statement, calling for restraint. The United States avoided direct comment. But silence, this time, spoke louder than words. Traoré didn't issue another statement. He didn't need to. His message had already broken through walls decades in the making. Walls built from silence, shame, and scripted diplomacy. What he had delivered at the UN was more than a speech. It was a reckoning. Days passed, but the fire ignited by Captain Ibrahim Traoré's speech refused to die. It grew, crossing borders faster than any ambassador could respond, louder than any official press release could silence. From north to south, east to west, the speech echoed in classrooms, markets, newsrooms, and military barracks. In Accra, university students organized impromptu debates about Africa's future, quoting Traoré's words like scripture. In Addis Ababa, Pan-African scholars wrote op-eds titled, "The Second Independence Has Begun." In Soweto, murals began to appear on crumbling walls, showing Traoré beside Sankara and Nkrumah, their fists raised high. This wasn't politics anymore. It was transformation. Something deep inside Africa had awakened. Not a man, not a party, but a spirit. A voice long buried beneath the rubble of colonialism and betrayal. And it was no longer asking for permission to rise. Even African leaders who had remained silent for years began to shift. Some out of fear, others out of guilt. A few, for the first time in their lives, out of courage. The youth led the charge. In the streets of Kinshasa, young men marched with signs reading "Africa for Africans." In Bamako, women gathered in front of government buildings, chanting "No more puppets." In Somalia, a teenage girl went viral for saying, "If we are poor with gold in our soil, then who is rich?" Social media became a battleground. Western analysts rushed to label the moment as populism, nationalism, even extremism. But they missed the point. This wasn't about hating the West. It was about loving Africa enough to stop watching it suffer in silence. A new wave of music hit the airwaves. Songs in Swahili, Hausa, Zulu, and Wolof, celebrating freedom, unity, and pride. Artists who once sang only about love and pain now sang about land, justice, and dignity. In Burkina Faso, Children who had never known clean water began dreaming of engineers who looked like them. Farmers in Niger began asking why they couldn't refine their own produce. Teachers in Cameroon rewrote lesson plans, placing African heroes at the center of history. It wasn't just the people changing. The land seemed to breathe differently. Flags were raised with more reverence. Languages once mocked in foreign schools were now spoken with pride. Old songs, old names, old traditions returned, not as memories, but as declarations. Traoré, for his part, remained quiet. He gave no interviews, held no victory parades. He went back to work as he always had, surrounded by soldiers, building something greater than applause, a foundation. And the message was clear. Africa is no longer waiting to be invited to the table. Africa is building its own house. The speech at the UN was not the climax. It was the beginning. Because once a people find their voice, there is no turning back. A continent had risen. And this time, it would not kneel again.